They say that when Jan Žižka died, his followers couldn't bear to let him rest. The man who had never lost a battle, who had led peasants to victory against the mightiest mights of Christendom, who had orchestrated the impossible with a tactical genius that defied comprehension, this man was too valuable to simply bury. So they skinned him, or so the legend goes. They stretched his hide across a war drum, believing that even in death, Žižka would lead them into battle. The rhythm of that drum, they believed, carried his iron will, his unbreakable spirit, his divine fury against those who would crush the faithful beneath golden crosses and papal bulls. Whether true or apocryphal, the legend tells you everything you need to know about Jan Žižka. He was a man so fearsome, so impossibly effective that even death seemed like merely another obstacle to overcome. A minor inconvenience for a warrior who had already conquered blindness itself. This is the story of how a one-eyed mercenary became a military genius, how he lost his remaining eye and continued to command armies with supernatural precision, and how he turned farmers with flails into the most terrifying military force in medieval Europe. This is the story of the Hussite Wars, where wagons became fortresses, where hymns became battle cries, and where the old order of chivalry came to die in the mud of Bohemia. The church called him a heretic. The Holy Roman Empire sent 5 crusades to destroy him. History remembers him as the only commander who never lost a battle. His name was Jan Žižka, and this is how he made the world tremble. The year was 1424, and Europe trembled at the mention of his name. For 5 years, the blind general had made fools of kings and popes. His peasant army had shattered crusade after crusade, and now, as fever consumed his body in a military camp in Moravia, the greatest question facing Christendom was not whether the Hussites could be defeated, but whether anyone would dare try once Žižka was gone. But to understand how a blind man became the terror of Europe, we must go back to the beginning. Back to when Jan Žižka still had both eyes, and no reason to believe he would change the world.
The village of Trocnov was the kind of place where nothing important ever happened. Nestled in the rolling hills of southern Bohemia, it was home to perhaps 100 souls who scratched a living from rocky soil and paid their taxes to distant lords who never bothered to visit. When Jan Žižka was born there around 1360, the exact year is lost to history. No one imagined that this child would become a legend. His family claimed noble status, but it was nobility in name only. They owned no grand estates, commanded no armies of retainers, lived in no castle. They were the rural poor who happened to have a family tree that included a minor knight 3 generations back. It was the kind of nobility that meant you were too proud to work in the fields, but too poor to do anything else. For Jan, being the second son made everything worse. His older brother would inherit what little the family had. Jan would get nothing. No land, no title, no future. He had 3 choices: enter a monastery and spend his life copying manuscripts, become a merchant if he could scrape together capital, or take up the sword and hope to live long enough to profit from violence. He chose violence. The choice was almost inevitable. Bohemia in the 14th century was caught in a web of conflicts. The Holy Roman Empire claimed nominal authority over the Czech lands, but real power was fragmented among competing nobles. Border wars with Bavaria and Austria were constant. The Teutonic Knights pressed from the north. Poland competed for influence from the east. And beneath all the political maneuvering, bandits and mercenary companies roamed freely, hired by whoever could pay. For a young man with nothing to lose and skill with weapons, it was a seller's market. Jan Žižka left Trocnov in his late teens, joining a mercenary company as a common soldier. The work was brutal and the pay terrible, but he survived. That alone put him ahead of most recruits who died in their first engagements or from the diseases that swept through military camps. The first eye. The blow that cost him his left eye came early in his career. The exact circumstances are lost. Some accounts claim it was an arrow during a skirmish with Bavarian knights. Others say a mace in a tavern brawl. Still others suggest a training accident. What matters is the result, a catastrophic injury that crushed his orbital socket and destroyed his left eye. The wound should have killed him. In the 14th century, facial injuries commonly led to infections that spread to the brain. Men died screaming from infected wounds far less severe. But Žižka's constitution was iron. He endured the pain, survived the fever, and when he recovered, he found his depth perception was gone, but his will to fight was not. Most commanders would have dismissed him as damaged goods. Archery was impossible with one eye, sword work was compromised, the loss of peripheral vision on his left side made him vulnerable. Žižka adapted. He trained obsessively to compensate for his missing eye. He learned to judge distances by other cues, the sound of approaching footsteps, the shadows cast by moving enemies, the feel of his horse beneath him. He positioned himself in formations to protect his blind side. He became more cautious, more calculating, less likely to take foolish risks. The injury that should have ended his career instead taught him his most important lesson. Warfare wasn't about individual heroics or perfect physical capability. It was about intelligence, positioning, and making your enemy fight on your terms. For the next 30 decades, Jan Žižka attended the only university that mattered to him, the battlefield. He sold his sword across Central Europe, learning the craft of war from every angle. He fought for Polish lords against the Teutonic Knights in the bitter conflicts along the Baltic coast. There he saw the arrogance of the German military orders, knights who believed their armor and breeding made them invincible. He also saw their weaknesses, how heavy cavalry bogged down in poor terrain, how rigid tactics made them predictable, and how their pride made them stupid. He traveled to the west, possibly even reaching France during the 100 Years' War. If the accounts are true, he saw English longbowmen devastate French knights at battles like Crécy and Poitiers. He learned that technology mattered, that a peasant with the right weapon could kill a noble as easily as another noble could. He fought in countless smaller engagements, border raids, siege warfare, quick brutal skirmishes in forests and river valleys. He learned logistics, how an army moved and fed itself, how supply lines determined victory as much as battlefield tactics. He learned about morale, how soldiers fight harder when they believe in their cause, and how demoralized troops collapse regardless of their numbers. Most importantly, he learned about social class and military effectiveness. The knights he fought alongside were often incompetent, men who had inherited their positions and relied on their armor to save them from their own stupidity. The common soldiers, mercenaries, pressed peasants, urban militias were often more capable when properly led. Nobility was an accident of birth. Competence was earned. By 1410, Žižka was 50 years old and had survived 3 decades of warfare. This alone was extraordinary. Most medieval soldiers died young. His scarred face, missing eye, and weathered appearance marked him as a professional survivor. And that year, he fought in what would be his most important battle before the Hussite Wars began. The Battle of Grunwald, called Tannenberg by the Germans, was one of medieval Europe's largest engagements. On July 15, 1410, the combined armies of Poland and Lithuania, supported by Czech mercenaries including Žižka's company, faced the full might of the Teutonic Knights. The Teutonic Order was one of Europe's most formidable military forces. These warrior monks had spent 2 centuries conquering and Christianizing the Baltic region through brutal crusades. They were wealthy, disciplined, and equipped with the finest armor and weapons available. Their knights were considered among the best heavy cavalry in the world. They were annihilated. The battle raged for hours. The Teutonic Knights made their traditional heavy cavalry charges, expecting to break the Polish-Lithuanian lines through shock and superior equipment. Instead, they found themselves drawn into a grinding melee where numbers and determination mattered more than individual knightly prowess. The Grand Master of the Teutonic Order died on the field along with hundreds of his knights. The order's military power was broken forever. And Jan Žižka, commanding his Czech mercenaries somewhere in that chaos, learned the most important lesson of his career. Heavy cavalry could be beaten. The myth of knightly invincibility was a lie. All you needed was the right tactics, proper preparation, and soldiers willing to stand their ground against the thunder of charging horses. Everything he would later accomplish in the Hussite Wars grew from the seed planted at Grunwald. When Jan Žižka returned to Bohemia after Grunwald, he found his homeland changing. The old mercenary took a position as a court official in Prague, managing the financial affairs of the royal household. It was comfortable, respectable work. A good retirement for an aging warrior. But Prague was crackling with tensions that would explode into war. At the center of the storm was Jan Hus, a theologian and preacher whose ideas were tearing Bohemian society apart. Hus challenged the Catholic Church on multiple fronts. He preached that Scripture should be available in Czech, not just in Latin, so common people could read God's Word themselves. He argued that the Church should become corrupt, more interested in wealth and power than salvation.
These ideas resonated powerfully in Bohemia. The Church owned perhaps the third of all land in the kingdom. Church courts claimed jurisdiction over vast areas of daily life. Bishops lived in opulence while peasants starved. And crucially, most high church officials in Bohemia were German, creating a nationalist as well as religious dimension to the conflict. The Czech nobility was divided. Some saw Hus's movement as a threat to social order. Others saw an opportunity to seize church lands and assert independence from both papal and imperial authority. The common people, artisans, peasants, lower clergy, embraced Hus's message with fervent enthusiasm. Žižka watched and listened. Unlike many nobles, he had spent his life among common soldiers, eating and sleeping alongside peasants pressed into service. He knew their resentments, understood their hunger for dignity and justice. When Hus preached against church corruption, Žižka recognized truth. In 1414, Jan Hus was invited to the Council of Constance to defend his ideas. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund personally guaranteed his safety with a promise of safe conduct. Hus accepted the invitation, believing that reason and scripture would vindicate him. It was a trap. The church arrested Hus immediately upon his arrival. They held a show trial where he was not permitted to truly defend himself. The charges against him were heresy, undermining church authority, and spreading dangerous doctrines. The verdict was predetermined. On July 6, 1415, Jan Hus was burned alive. They made him wear a paper crown painted with devils while the flames consumed him. He sang hymns as he died. His last words allegedly were, "In 100 years, God will raise up a man whose calls for reform cannot be suppressed." He was right. 97 years later, Martin Luther would nail his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, igniting the Protestant Reformation. But before Luther, there would be the Hussites. And before the Hussites could fight, they needed a general. Bohemia simmered with rage after Hus's execution. Sigismund's betrayal, guaranteeing safe conduct, then allowing Hus to burn, destroyed any remaining trust in imperial or papal authority. The Hussites, calling themselves Hussites, began organizing. They demanded communion in both kinds, bread and wine, for all believers, not just clergy, services in Czech language, an end to church land ownership, and punishment for mortal sins by civil authority, not just church courts. These were revolutionary demands that struck at the foundation of medieval Catholic authority. King Wenceslaw IV tried to maintain order, playing both sides, but his authority was crumbling. In Prague, tensions escalated daily. Hussite preachers drew huge crowds. Catholic priests were shouted down or attacked. Monasteries were vandalized. Then came July 30th, 1419. A Hussite procession marched through Prague, thousands strong, demanding the release of imprisoned reformers. They carried banners and sang hymns, their mood ugly with suppressed violence. When the new town city council refused their demands, the crowd's patience snapped. Led by radical priest Jan Žižka, the Hussites stormed the town hall. They seized 7 councillors, men who represented royal and church authority, and dragged them to the windows. One by one, they threw them out.
The fall alone killed most. Those who survived impact with the cobblestones were beaten to death by the mob below. Blood ran in the streets of Prague. The first defenestration, or throwing officials out of windows, would become a Czech tradition. It was open rebellion, an act of war against church and crown. King Wenceslas, already in poor health, suffered a stroke when he heard the news. He died on August 16, 1419, leaving the Bohemian throne to his half-brother Sigismund, the same Sigismund who had betrayed Jan Hus. The Hussites would never accept him as king. Pope Martin V declared a crusade against Bohemia, offering full indulgences to any Christian who would take up arms against the heretics. From across Catholic Europe, knights began preparing for holy war. The wealth of Bohemia would be their reward. The extermination of heresy would be their glory. The Hussites faced annihilation. Into this desperate moment stepped Jan Žižka. He was 59 years old, blind in one eye, scarred by decades of warfare, with no great estate or title. But he had something the Hussites desperately needed. He knew how to kill the men who were coming to kill you. When the Hussite leadership asked him to organize their defense, Žižka accepted, but he made his terms clear. I will lead you to victory, but you will obey me absolutely. I don't command by noble birth or church appointment. I command because I know how to kill the men who are coming to kill you. If you want priests and politicians making military decisions, find another general. If you want to win, you follow my orders without question. They agreed. Jan Žižka had found his cause, and he would never lose again. The Hussites, who gathered under Žižka's command in the autumn of 1419, were not an army. They were a mob with delusions of competence. Most had never held weapons beyond farming tools. They had no armor, no horses, no military training. There were craftsmen and peasants, minor clergy and urban poor, united by religious fervor but utterly unprepared for the professional armies marching toward them. Žižka looked at this rabble and saw raw material. He would forge them into something the world had never seen. His first act was brutal culling. He dismissed anyone unwilling to submit to military discipline. The Hussites were religious radicals who believed in equality before God, but Žižka made clear that on the battlefield there was no equality, only commanders and soldiers, orders and obedience. God gave you free will, he told them. I'm taking it away. On campaign, you act when I command, where I command, how I command. God will judge your souls. I will judge your military effectiveness. Those who stayed faced rigorous training. Žižka drilled them relentlessly in formation fighting, teaching peasants to stand firm against cavalry charges that would make their bowels loosen with fear. He taught them to trust the men beside them, to fight as a unit rather than individuals. He organized them into companies of 50 men, each with clear roles. Some would be crossbowmen. The crossbow was the great equalizer, allowing an untrained peasant to kill an armored knight with relatively little practice. Others would wield pole weapons, pikes, halberds, and improvised weapons adapted from farm tools. The flail, a farming implement for threshing grain, became a deadly weapon against armored opponents. Its chains allowed the weighted head to wrap around shields and crush skulls inside helmets. But training alone wouldn't save them. Žižka needed a tactical revolution. The idea came from observation and necessity. Hussite armies needed to be mobile. They couldn't defend fixed positions against larger forces, but they also needed protection against heavy cavalry, which remained the dominant force on medieval battlefields. Wagons were the answer. Military supply trains had used wagons for centuries, but Žižka transformed them into a weapons system. He ordered the construction of specialized war wagons, each designed according to precise specifications. The wagons were heavy, built from thick oak planks that could stop arrows and crossbow bolts. The sides had firing ports at multiple heights, allowing defenders to shoot from protected positions. Heavy wooden shields mounted on the sides provided additional protection. The wagon beds were large enough to carry ammunition, food, and wounded men. Iron plating reinforced critical areas. Each wagon had a crew of 15 to 20 men, drivers, fighters, and shooters. Hooks and chains allowed wagons to be rapidly linked together. Metal stakes could be driven into the ground to anchor the formation. Gaps between wagons could be covered with chains at ankle height to trip charging horses. When deployed, these wagons formed a mobile fortress, the Wagenburg. A typical Hussite army might have 300 to 500 wagons, which could be arranged in a circle, square, or rectangle, depending on terrain and tactical needs. Inside this fortress, Žižka positioned his troops in carefully organized layers. The genius of the system was its flexibility. Unlike stone castles that were fixed in place, the Wagenburg could be established anywhere, in open fields, on hilltops, in valleys, even in urban environments. The Hussites could choose their battlefield, set up their fortress, and force enemies to attack on Hussite terms. But the Wagenburg wasn't purely defensive. Žižka designed it as a base for offensive operations. Gaps in the wagon line allowed cavalry to sally forth and strike enemy flanks. After breaking an enemy charge, the entire formation could advance, wagons rolling forward while maintaining defensive integrity. It was combined arms warfare centuries before the concept would be formally articulated. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery, as it was, early cannons and hand bombards, working in coordination, each element supporting the others. Žižka understood that warfare was as much psychological as physical. He needed to make his army terrifying, to break enemy morale before swords were ever drawn. The Hussites developed several weapons specifically designed to terrorize opponents. The hakovnicha, an early handgun mounted on wagon walls or wielded by infantry. These weapons were inaccurate and slow to reload, but their noise and smoke were psychologically devastating. Horses in particular panicked at the sound of gunfire. Knights who had trained their entire lives for mounted combat found their war horses uncontrollable in the face of these new weapons. The Hufnitscher, a primitive cannon, the precursor to the howitzer, the Hussites mounted these on special wagons, creating mobile artillery. Again, their effectiveness was more psychological than practical. They rarely hit specific targets, but the sound of cannon fire and the sight of stone balls smashing into enemy lines broke formations and shattered morale. The pavis, large shields that could be planted in the ground, behind which crossbowmen could shelter while reloading, this allowed sustained fire from protected positions. And then there were the flails. The Hussite flail became legendary, a wooden handle attached by chain to a heavy spiked ball. Against armored knights, the flail was brutally effective. The chain allowed it to wrap around shields, and the momentum of the weighted head could crush armor and break bones. It was a peasant weapon that could kill nobility, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. But Žižka's deadliest weapon was sound. Before every battle, the Hussites sang. Their hymn, Kukta Zisu Boži bojovnici, you who are warriors of God, became as feared as their weapons. Thousands of voices in harmony, singing with absolute conviction, created a sound that rolled across battlefields like thunder. To the Hussites, it was a prayer and a promise. To their enemies, it was the sound of fanaticism, of men who welcomed death because they believed they fought for God. The psychological effect was devastating. Knights preparing to charge heard that hymn and felt, maybe for the first time in their lives, genuine fear. These weren't just soldiers, they were religious zealots who seemed to welcome martyrdom. How do you intimidate men who aren't afraid to die? Žižka encouraged this perception. He made sure his men sang loudly, sang often, and sang with conviction. The hymn became a weapon as deadly as any sword.
The first test of Žižka's revolutionary system came quickly.
In November 1419, a royalist army marched to crush the Hussite rebellion before it could truly organize. They numbered perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 men, a mix of professional soldiers, minor nobility, and Catholic loyalists. They outnumbered Žižka's forces and included experienced commanders who expected to scatter these peasant rebels in a single engagement. Žižka chose his ground carefully, a hillside outside the town of Sudomir that provided defensive advantages. He deployed his Wagenburg in a crescent formation, wagons chained together, stakes driven into the ground, firing ports positioned for maximum coverage. Then he waited. The royalist commanders saw the wagon formation and were puzzled but not concerned. Wagons were supply train, not battlefield units. They expected the Hussites to emerge and fight properly. When they didn't, the royalists decided to simply overrun the position with cavalry. It was a fatal mistake. The first cavalry charge thundered up the hill, knights in full armor expecting to crash through peasant lines. Instead, they ran into concentrated crossbow fire from protected positions. Horses screamed and fell, riders pitched forward into the mud. Those who reached the wagon line found themselves funneled into narrow gaps where Hussite infantry waited with pole weapons and flails. The Hakovnice fired with their distinctive crack, adding smoke and thunder to the chaos. Horses panicked. The cavalry charge dissolved into confusion. The royalists regrouped and tried again and again. Each time they broke against the Wagenburg like waves against stone. Žižka had positioned his troops perfectly. Every attacking soldier found himself in a kill zone, under fire from multiple angles, unable to bring superior numbers to bear because the terrain and wagon formation funneled them into narrow approaches. By afternoon, the royalist army was exhausted and demoralized. They had lost hundreds of men without inflicting significant casualties on the Hussites. Then Žižka counterattacked. Gaps opened in the wagon line. Hussite cavalry, yes, Žižka had cavalry too, composed of minor nobles and well-mounted soldiers, poured through and struck the royalists' flanks. Infantry followed, moving with discipline that shocked opponents who expected peasant mobs. The royalist army broke. What had been an organized military force dissolved into fleeing men. The Hussites pursued without mercy, cutting down soldiers for miles. It wasn't just a victory. It was a complete rout, and it announced to all of Bohemia and beyond that the Hussites could fight. After Sudomir, recruits flocked to Žižka's banner. Peasants who had lived their entire lives in submission to lords and clergy suddenly saw a possibility. They could fight, could win, could change the world. Žižka organized Tabor with military precision. The town itself was fortified with walls and towers. Inside, workshops produced weapons and wagons according to his specifications. Training grounds where recruits drilled constantly. Warehouses stored food and ammunition. Everything was designed to support sustained warfare. He established strict discipline. Theft was punished by death. Cowardice in battle meant execution. Rape or abuse of civilians, even enemy civilians, resulted in hanging. Žižka understood that an army must be feared by its enemies, but trusted by friendly populations. Undisciplined soldiers would destroy the Hussite cause as surely as any enemy army. The Taborite community functioned as both civilian society and military organization, with no clear distinction between the two. Every able-bodied man trained for combat. Women managed logistics, manufactured ammunition, and in emergencies fought alongside men. Children learned hymns and basic military skills. The entire society was mobilized for total war. By early 1420, Žižka had transformed a collection of religious radicals into an effective military force. But his greatest challenges lay ahead. The Catholic Church was preparing its response, and when the Crusades came, they would come with the full might of Christendom behind them.
Spring 1420 brought ominous news. Pope Martin V had issued a papal bull declaring a crusade against the Hussite heretics. Kings and nobles across Catholic Europe answered the call. A massive army was assembling. Estimates ranged from 80,000 to over 150,000 men, though medieval numbers were always unreliable. What was certain, it was the largest military force gathered in Central Europe in decades. At its head was King Sigismund, the man who had betrayed Jan Hus. Sigismund intended to claim the Bohemian crown by force and exterminate the Hussite heretics who opposed him. He had papal blessing, imperial authority, and overwhelming military superiority. The Hussites should have been destroyed within weeks. Sigismund divided his massive army to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. One force besieged Prague, where moderate Hussites still controlled the city. Another marched into southern Bohemia toward Tabor. A third moved through Moravia. The strategy was sound. Surround and overwhelm, give the heretics no chance to concentrate their forces. Žižka saw the trap. If he tried to defend Tabor, Prague would fall. If Prague fell, the moderate Hussites would be crushed, and the Taborites would face the full crusade alone. He made a decision that looked suicidal. He would march to Prague with his army, perhaps 9,000 men, and break the siege. His officers thought he was insane. They were outnumbered at least 5 to 1, perhaps 10 to 1. Marching toward a besieging army with inferior numbers violated every principle of military wisdom. But Žižka understood psychology. The Crusaders expected the Hussites to cower in their fortified towns. They expected to fight peasants, not an organized army. They had never faced the Wagenburg. And most crucially, they believed God favored their crusade. They were unprepared for serious resistance. The Hussites marched on Prague, their war wagons rolling, their hymns carrying across the countryside. They moved with purpose and discipline that surprised observers. This wasn't a mob, it was an army. On July 14, 1420, outside Prague, Žižka made his stand. He chose Vítkov Hill, a steep height overlooking the city. The hill provided excellent defensive terrain, steep approaches, good visibility, solid ground for positioning wagons. If the Crusaders wanted Prague, they would have to go through the Hussites first. Žižka deployed his Wagenburg in his standard formation. 300 wagons linked in a crescent, stakes driven into the ground, firing ports positioned, ammunition distributed. Behind the wagons, his infantry prepared. Crossbowmen checked their weapons. Handgunners loaded their hakovnice. Pole weapon specialists positioned themselves at likely breach points. And they sang. The hymn rolled down from Vítkov Hill, thousands of voices proclaiming their faith and defiance. Ye who are warriors of God. The Crusader commanders stared up at the hill. They had never seen anything like this, a peasant army that had fortified a hilltop with wagons. It looked absurd, almost comical. Wagons weren't military equipment. They ordered the attack. Wave after wave of cavalry charged up Vítkov Hill. German knights, Hungarian horsemen, professional soldiers from across Catholic Europe. They came with lances lowered and confidence high. They were the elite of medieval warfare, the armored nobility who had never known defeat by commoners. They broke against the Wagenburg like waves against cliffs. The approaches were too steep for effective cavalry charges. Horses struggled uphill, riders were exposed to concentrated crossbow fire from protected positions. The hakovnice fired with their terrifying crack. Those who reached the wagon line found no gaps to exploit, only killing zones where massed Hussite infantry waited with flails and pikes. Bodies piled up at the base of Vítkov Hill. Horses screamed, knights cursed and died. The battle raged for hours. The Crusaders threw thousands of men at that hill, certain that sheer numbers must eventually prevail. They were wrong.
Žižka was everywhere, his single eye taking in the entire battlefield. He moved from position to position, reinforcing weak points, directing fire, encouraging his men. When a breach opened in the wagon line, he personally led a counterattack to seal it. When ammunition ran low on the left flank, he shifted supplies from the right. His commands were precise, his tactical awareness perfect. By evening, the Crusaders withdrew in disorder. They had lost thousands. Estimates range from 300 to over 1,000 killed, with thousands more wounded. The Hussites had lost perhaps 60 men. It wasn't just a victory, it was a humiliation. Sigismund's great crusade, blessed by the Pope and assembled with such fanfare and confidence, had been shattered by peasants defending a hilltop with wagons. The psychological impact was devastating. If the Hussites could defeat the full might of Christendom at Vitkov, they could defeat anything. The siege of Prague was broken. Sigismund retreated. The First Crusade had failed. And Jan Žižka became a legend. Victory followed victory through 1420 and early 1421. At Vyšehrad, at Pankratz, at Deutschbrod, everywhere Jan Žižka led his army, the Hussites won. The Wagenburg proved devastatingly effective against cavalry charges. The disciplined Hussite infantry proved more than a match for professional soldiers. The hymns and psychological warfare broke enemy morale before battles even began. But warfare always exacts its price. In late 1421, Žižka was directing a siege of Raby Castle when it happened. Sources conflict on the details. Some say it was a crossbow bolt fired from the castle walls. Others claim an arrow from a defender's bow. The specific weapon doesn't matter. What matters is where it hit. The projectile struck Žižka's remaining good eye. The pain must have been extraordinary, a sharp point penetrating the eye socket, destroying tissue, the immediate flood of blood and agony. Žižka was dragged from the fighting by his men. Field surgeons, such as there were in the 15th century, examined the wound and knew immediately that the eye was lost. Jan Žižka, at 61 years old, was now completely blind. For any other commander, this would have been the end. How could a blind man lead armies? How could he assess terrain, read enemy formations, coordinate complex tactical maneuvers? His officers expected him to retire to Tabor to live out his remaining years as an honored advisor. Instead, after recovering from the initial injury, Žižka returned to command. He said to his stunned officers, "I don't need eyes to see what God has already shown me, and I don't need eyes to know how to kill our enemies." What followed was perhaps the most remarkable period in military history, a completely blind commander who not only continued to lead armies, but achieved his greatest victories in absolute darkness. How was it possible for a blind man to command armies? The answer lay in Žižka's systematic approach to warfare and the disciplined organization he had imposed on his forces. First, he relied on detailed reconnaissance reports. His scouts learned to describe terrain with extraordinary precision. The river bends north here, about 100 paces wide, rocky bottom, suitable for crossing. The opposite bank rises steeply for 200 paces, then levels to a plateau. Forest covers the western approach, trees thick enough to prevent cavalry, but allowing infantry movement.
From these descriptions, Žižka would construct a complete mental map. His decades of military experience allowed him to visualize terrain, understand its tactical implications, and devise plans without ever seeing the ground himself. Second, he developed a highly efficient command structure. His officers were trained to act as his eyes on the battlefield. Riders continuously reported, "Enemy cavalry forming on our left flank, 6 squadrons, perhaps 800 riders, distance 400 paces in closing." Žižka would process this information instantly, shift 30 wagons to reinforce left flank, tell Captain Hviesta to ready his pike formations, signal gunners to concentrate fire at 200 paces. His commands were specific, detailed, and based on tactical principles he understood perfectly. He didn't need to see to know how cavalry would attack, how infantry should respond, how to coordinate combined arms. Third, he had earned absolute trust from his men. They believed in him with religious fervor. When Žižka issued orders, they were executed without hesitation. This unity of purpose and trust in command allowed him to coordinate complex operations through subordinates who functioned as extensions of his will. Fourth, he adapted his tactics. Freed from visual distractions, Žižka's mind became even more focused on pure tactical calculation. He processed information more efficiently, made decisions more quickly, and maintained a strategic overview that many sighted commanders couldn't match. The Hussites believed God had taken Žižka's eyes to sharpen his inner vision. Their enemies believed he was a demon who couldn't be defeated by mortal means. Both beliefs served Žižka perfectly. The battles Žižka fought while blind showcased his genius at its peak. At Kutná-Hora in December 1421, he faced his most desperate situation. Žižka occupied the town with only about 300 men when a massive royalist army surrounded him, perhaps 20,000 soldiers. His officers urged him to attempt a breakout immediately before the encirclement was complete. Žižka refused. We wait for the right moment. Desperation makes men predictable. For days, the situation grew more dire. Supplies dwindled. The royalists tightened their grip. Every conventional military principle said Žižka was trapped and doomed. Then came a blinding snowstorm. Žižka, who couldn't see anyway, seized the opportunity that would have paralyzed a sighted commander. In the howling snow and darkness, he led his entire force out of Kutná-Hora. His men moved by touch and trust, following their blind general, who navigated by memory and description, slipping through enemy lines that couldn't see 3 feet in front of them. By morning, when the storm cleared, the royalists found Kutná-Hora empty. Žižka had vanished like a ghost. But he hadn't retreated. He had repositioned. At Kulín, Žižka reunited with reinforcements and established a classic wagonburg. When the pursuing royalist army arrived, expecting to finish off a defeated remnant, they instead found Žižka had been reinforced and fortified. The ensuing battle was a slaughter. The royalist army was annihilated. It was military genius operating at the highest level. Žižka had turned apparent defeat into devastating victory through patience, timing, and the courage to wait for the perfect moment. At Německý Brod in January 1422, Žižka achieved perhaps his most complete victory. He faced a German and Hungarian force of approximately 12,000 men. The enemy commanders, learning from previous defeats, attempted to counter the wagonburg by using their own fortified positions and refusing to charge directly. Žižka's response was masterful. He feigned a retreat, drawing the enemy out of their positions. When they pursued, believing the Hussites were fleeing, Žižka suddenly wheeled his entire army around, formed the wagonburg with practiced efficiency, and caught the enemy in the open. The battle was brief and brutal. Hussite crossbow fire and cannon decimated the disorganized enemy. When they broke, Žižka's cavalry pursued relentlessly. Estimates suggest over 10,000 enemy soldiers died that day. The German and Hungarian commanders were captured or killed. It remains one of the most lopsided victories in medieval military history, and it was orchestrated by a blind man. But Žižka's greatest challenge wasn't external enemies. It was the growing divisions among the Hussites themselves. The movement had always contained contradictions. The radical Taborites, Žižka's core followers, wanted complete religious and social revolution. They rejected almost all Catholic practices, destroyed religious images and relics, practiced communal property ownership, and insisted on absolute equality among believers. The Utraquists, based in Prague, were more moderate. They wanted reform, communion in both kinds, Czech language services, limits to church property, but not revolution. They were willing to negotiate with Catholic authorities and maintain traditional social structures. By 1423, these tensions had erupted into open conflict. Žižka found himself fighting other Hussites, battles between believers who agreed on core principles but differed on how far reformation should go. It was heartbreaking. These were men who had fought together against crusades, who had sung the same hymns, who believed in the same God. Now they were killing each other over doctrinal differences and political compromises. At Horziki in April 1423, Žižka faced a combined army of moderate Hussites and Catholic forces. It was the ultimate betrayal. Hussites allied with the very crusaders they had fought together to defeat, all because the radicals wouldn't compromise on their vision of reformation. Žižka's response was characteristically brutal. He crushed the combined force with tactical precision, showing no mercy to former allies who had turned against the cause. War is war, he believed, and betrayal deserves only annihilation. But the psychological cost was enormous.
Žižka had spent years building the Hussite movement into a unified force. Now he watched it tear itself apart. Victory after victory against external enemies meant nothing if the movement destroyed itself from within. The blind general could defeat any army on any battlefield, but he couldn't defeat human nature, the tendency for factionalism, the inability to maintain unity without external enemies, the tragedy of revolutions that devour their children. By 1424, Žižka was 64 years old. His body bore decades of wounds, he was completely blind, he should have been dead 100 times over, but he fought on, driven by iron will and absolute conviction in his cause. That summer, he led a campaign into Moravia, continuing to spread the Hussite revolution beyond Bohemia's borders. His army moved with characteristic efficiency, the wagons rolling, the hymns echoing across the countryside, but the decades of warfare had taken their toll. In September, while besieging Plebiscitov Castle, Žižka fell ill. Some sources suggest plague, though that's uncertain. Others indicate an infected wound finally overwhelmed his body. Medical medicine, as it was, could do nothing. For days, Žižka lay in his command tent, fever consuming him. His officers gathered, knowing the end was near. The man who had never lost a battle was losing his final fight, against mortality itself. On October 11, 1424, Jan Žižka died. His last reported words were characteristic. "Make my skin into drums, so that I may continue to lead you in battle." Whether he actually said this or whether it's legend created after his death doesn't matter. The statement perfectly captured Žižka's essence, the warrior who refused to acknowledge limitations, who believed that even death was merely another tactical problem to overcome.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
After Žižka's death, his followers faced a terrible question. How do you continue without the man who made you invincible? The legend says they solved this problem in the most dramatic way possible. They skinned Žižka's corpse and stretched his hide across war drums. Whether this actually happened remains one of history's great mysteries. No physical evidence has ever been found. No contemporary accounts definitively confirm it. But the story spread throughout Europe with the force of absolute truth. Why? Because even if it was myth, it expressed something essential about Žižka and the Hussites. They couldn't let him go. The man who had transformed peasants into conquerors, who had defeated 5 crusades, who had never known defeat, such a man couldn't simply die and disappear. His spirit, his tactical genius, his unbreakable will had to continue somehow. So the legend emerged. Žižka's skin became drums. When Hussite armies marched into battle, those drums beat the rhythm of their advance. The sound carried Žižka's presence, his iron discipline, his fury against those who would crush the faithful. To the Hussites, beating those drums meant Žižka still led them. To their enemies, the drums were psychological warfare. How do you defeat an army guided by a dead man's ghost? The legend was perhaps more powerful than the reality. Crusader soldiers heard stories of the skin drums and felt primal fear. They weren't just fighting human opponents, they were fighting against something supernatural, unkillable, sustained by dark magic or divine intervention, depending on your perspective. Medieval chroniclers, both Hussite and Catholic, repeated the story. It spread to England, France, Italy, Spain. Everywhere, people spoke in hushed tones about the heretic general whose skin still terrorized Christendom. The psychological impact was devastating to Crusader recruitment and morale. Would you volunteer to fight an army led by a corpse? But legends alone don't win wars. The Hussites needed actual military leadership. And they found it in Prokop the Great, Prokop Huli. Prokop had been one of Žižka's most talented subordinates, a priest who had learned the master's tactics and absorbed his ruthless pragmatism. He lacked Žižka's personal charisma and the aura of invincibility, but he was a brilliant commander in his own right. More importantly, he understood that he was operating in Žižka's shadow, and he used that to his advantage. He made sure his armies carried drums said to contain Žižka's skin. He evoked Žižka's name before battles. He employed Žižka's tactics with precision. In essence, he channeled his predecessor's ghost. And it worked. Under Prokop's command, the Hussites continued their string of victories. The Wagenburg remained devastatingly effective. The war hymn still broke enemy morale. The combination of religious fanaticism and tactical sophistication still made the Hussite armies nearly unbeatable. But Prokop added his own innovations. He understood that defensive victories alone wouldn't end the wars. The Catholics would keep sending crusades until Bohemia was exhausted or destroyed. The Hussites needed to take the war to their enemies. The beautiful rides. Between 1426 and 1433, the Hussites launched massive raids into neighboring territories, expeditions they called beautiful rides, with characteristic grim humor. These weren't just raids, they were full-scale military campaigns that devastated huge swaths of Central Europe. Hussite armies swept through Silesia, Saxony, Bavaria, Austria, and Hungary. They reached the Baltic Sea in the north and the Danube in the south. They penetrated deep into Germany, coming within sight of cities like Nuremberg and Bamberg. Everywhere they went, they destroyed Catholic churches, seized resources, and spread terror. The beautiful rides served multiple strategic purposes. First, they seized wealth and supplies to sustain the Bohemian war effort. The Hussites couldn't afford a long war of attrition. They needed to live off enemy territory. Second, they demonstrated that attacking Bohemia had consequences. If Crusaders invaded, the Hussites would respond by devastating their homelands. It was strategic deterrence through punitive expeditions. Third, the raids spread Hussite ideas. In every town they passed through, Hussite preachers addressed the populace, explaining their cause, challenging Catholic authority, planting seeds of Reformation. Many of these seeds would later bloom in the Protestant Reformation. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the raids shattered the myth of Catholic invincibility. For 1,000 years, the Catholic Church had claimed universal authority backed by divine power. Now, heretical armies ranged freely across Catholic Europe, burning churches and defeating every force sent against them. The psychological and spiritual impact was enormous. At Auxig in 1426, a massive German crusading army confronted the Hussites. The Germans had learned from previous defeats. They brought heavy artillery, constructed their own wagon fortifications, and tried to use Hussite tactics against Hussites. The battle was fierce, lasting all day with heavy casualties on both sides, but ultimately superior Hussite discipline and tactical flexibility prevailed. When the Germans finally broke, the Hussite pursuit was relentless. Thousands of Crusaders drowned trying to cross the Elbe River in retreat. The victory at Auxig confirmed that even when enemies adopted Hussite methods, the originals still fought better. It wasn't just the tactics, it was the combination of technique, training, belief, and the psychological advantage of fighting for your home against invaders. The Fourth Anti-Hussite Crusade, launched in 1427, resulted in perhaps the most extraordinary Hussite victory, one achieved without fighting a battle. Frederick, Margrave of Brandenburg, assembled another massive crusading army. Estimates suggest over 100,000 men, although medieval numbers are always questionable. What's certain is that this was an enormous force drawn from across Catholic Europe. Germans, Hungarians, Austrians, even contingents from Poland and England. They marched into Bohemia with confidence, certain that sheer overwhelming numbers must prevail, where previous crusades had failed. The armies met near Takov in western Bohemia in August 1427. The Crusaders saw the Hussite Wagenburg forming on a hillside. They heard the war hymns beginning, thousands of voices raised in that haunting melody that had preceded so many Crusader defeats. Ye who are warriors of God, and the entire Crusader army broke. Without a single blow struck, without arrows fired or charges made, over 100,000 men fled in panic. Knights abandoned their armor to run faster. Nobles fled on horses, leaving their soldiers behind. Banners were thrown aside, weapons were dropped. The most massive military force assembled against the Hussites dissolved into a terrified mob. The Hussites pursued, turning retreat into massacre. The beautiful ride that followed devastated Saxony and Bavaria for months. What had happened? How had an entire army fled without fighting? The answer was psychological collapse. These crusaders had heard the stories. 5 years of unbroken Hussite victories, the blind general who never lost, the skin drums, the fanatical warriors who welcomed death. They had marched expecting a righteous war blessed by God. Instead, they faced the terrifying reality that maybe, just maybe, God favored the heretics.
When they saw the wagon fortress and heard that hymn, every story, every fear, every doubt crystallized into pure panic. And panic is contagious. When the first soldiers turned to flee, others followed, and within minutes the entire army was running. It was the ultimate victory. Defeating an enemy through reputation alone, through psychological warfare perfected over years of conflict. Žižka would have appreciated the efficiency. Why waste men and ammunition when your enemies will defeat themselves? By 1430, the Catholic Church was in crisis. 5 crusades had failed. The Hussites controlled Bohemia and raided at will across Central Europe. The Church's authority had been gravely wounded by its inability to suppress the heresy. Worse, the Hussite ideas were spreading. Across Europe, people began questioning church practices, demanding services in vernacular languages, challenging clerical corruption. The seeds of the Protestant Reformation were germinating, watered by Hussite victories. Pope Martin V died in 1431, his anti-Hussite crusades having accomplished nothing but demonstrating church weakness. His successor, Pope Eugene IV, recognized that military solutions had failed. Negotiation became the only viable option. The Council of Basel, beginning in 1431, invited Hussite representatives to present their demands. This was itself revolutionary. The Church was negotiating with heretics as equals rather than simply condemning them. The Hussites presented their 4 articles of Prague. 1. Freedom of preaching the Word of God. 2. Communion in both kinds, bread and wine, for all believers. 3. The poverty of the clergy and secularization of church property. 4. Public punishment of mortal sins. These demands struck at the foundation of medieval Catholic authority. The Church could accept some reform, but total capitulation would destroy its structural power. Negotiations dragged on for years, complicated by divisions among the Hussites themselves. The radical Taborites, Žižka's original followers, rejected any compromise. They wanted complete reformation. The 4 articles were minimum demands, not final goals. Many Taborites held proto-communist economic views, practiced extreme religious simplification, and envisioned a complete transformation of society. The moderate Utraquists, controlling Prague and representing more conservative elements, were willing to negotiate. They wanted reform, but within existing social structures. They would accept papal authority if the Church granted their core demands. This split had existed since Žižka's time, but his iron authority and military victories had kept it contained. With Žižka dead and the immediate Crusader threat diminished, the split became catastrophic. By 1434, the Utraquists had secretly negotiated the Compact Tata with the Council of Basel, a compromise agreement granting some Hussite demands while bringing Bohemia back into the Catholic fold. The Taborites viewed this as betrayal of everything they had fought for. On May 30th, 1434, at Lipane, east of Prague, the conflict came to its terrible conclusion. An army of moderate Hussites and Catholic forces faced the Taborite army. It was Hussite tactics against Hussite tactics. Wagenburg versus Wagenburg, disciples of Žižka's methods fighting each other with the same weapons and tactics they had perfected together. The Utraquist Catholic alliance was larger and better supplied. The Taborites fought with desperate courage, knowing defeat meant annihilation. By evening, the Taborite army was destroyed.
Prokop the Great died fighting. The Hussite military force was shattered. Survivors fled into mountains or were hunted down and killed. The Hussite Wars effectively ended at Lapani, not with Crusader victory, but through internal betrayal. The movement that had terrified Europe for 15 years destroyed itself. The irony was crushing. Žižka's Hussites had never lost to external enemies. They lost to themselves. But in a strange way, the Hussites had won. The Compactada, ratified in 1436, granted many Hussite demands. Bohemia gained religious autonomy unprecedented in medieval Europe. The Utrecht Church received papal recognition, communion in both kinds, Czech language services, and significant independence. Church property was secularized, clergy power was limited. These were revolutionary achievements. For the first time, Rome had been forced to compromise with heretics. The Church's claim to universal and absolute authority was broken. The Utrecht Church survived for nearly 2 centuries, until the Catholic Counter-Reformation finally suppressed it in the 1620s. During that time, Bohemia enjoyed religious freedom that wouldn't exist elsewhere in Europe for generations. More importantly, the Hussites had proven something that could never be unlearned: that the Catholic Church and the feudal nobility could be challenged, that peasants properly organized could defeat knights, that religious reformation was possible even against violent suppression. Martin Luther, born just 9 years after the Hussite Wars ended, was growing up in a world transformed by Žižka's battles. When Luther nailed his 95 Theses to that church door in 1717, he was following a trail blazed in Bohemian blood. The Protestant Reformation succeeded where the Hussites had failed because Luther learned from their experience. Don't concentrate Reformation in one vulnerable region. Spread it everywhere. Don't rely solely on military resistance. Use the printing press to spread ideas faster than armies can suppress them. Don't create a single revolutionary movement that can be divided and conquered. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. But the foundation was laid in Bohemia, by peasants with flails and crossbows, singing their war hymn behind wagons chained together, led by a blind old man who refused to accept defeat.
When military historians compile lists of history's greatest commanders, Alexander, Caesar, Hannibal, Napoleon, Suvorov, they rarely include Jan Žižka. This is an oversight that reveals more about cultural bias than military reality. Consider the statistics. Žižka never lost a battle, not one defeat in his entire recorded career as a commander. Even accounting for unreliable medieval documentation, this record is extraordinary. Napoleon lost at Waterloo and Leipzig. Hannibal lost at Zama. Robert E. Lee lost at Gettysburg. Caesar struggled in several engagements. Žižka died undefeated. But statistics alone don't capture his significance. What makes Žižka exceptional is the context of his victories and the transformations he achieved. He took illiterate peasants and transformed them into armies that defeated the finest knights in Europe. He was 59 when he became a general, 61 when he lost his remaining eye, and 64 when he died. Ancient by medieval standards, yet he achieved military miracles that commanders half his age couldn't match. He faced overwhelming numerical disadvantages in almost every engagement. The crusading armies outnumbered him 3-1, 5-1, sometimes 10-1. He fought with inferior equipment. His men had crossbows and improvised weapons against armored cavalry and professional soldiers. Yet he won every time. Modern military analysts studying Žižka's campaigns discover principles that wouldn't be formally articulated for centuries. Defense in depth. Žižka never relied on a single defensive line. His Wagenburg formations had multiple layers: outer wagon walls, inner reserves positioned to plug breaches, mobile cavalry ready for counterattacks. Enemies who penetrated the first line found themselves in carefully designed kill zones, under fire from multiple angles, unable to exploit their breakthrough.
This concept, that defense should be layered and active rather than a simple barrier, anticipated military thinking that wouldn't become standard until the 20th century. Soviet deep battle doctrine, German defensive in-depth tactics in World War II, modern elastic defense concepts all have intellectual roots in Žižka's Wagenburg. Combined arms integration. He coordinated infantry, cavalry, and artillery, primitive as it was, into a unified system where each element supported the others. Crossbowmen and handgunners provided ranged fire. Pike formations protected against cavalry. Flail-wielding infantry delivered shock assault. Cavalry exploited breakthroughs and pursued broken enemies. This seems obvious to modern military professionals, but it was revolutionary for an era when knights fought as glory-seeking individuals. Medieval battles were typically a series of personal combats, with each warrior seeking individual renown. Žižka transformed warfare into a systematic, coordinated effort where individual heroism was subordinated to collective effectiveness. Logistics as strategy. Žižka understood that armies march on their stomachs and fight with secured supply lines. His wagon trains served triple duty: transport, fortification, and weapons platform. The Wagenburg was simultaneously his supply chain and his main tactical asset. He positioned supply bases strategically, maintained iron discipline regarding resource consumption, and ensured his armies could sustain operations far from friendly territory. During the beautiful rides, Hussite forces ranged hundreds of miles from Bohemia for months at a time, maintaining combat effectiveness throughout because Žižka had built logistical sustainability into the basic structure of the army. Psychological operations, the war hymns, the terrifying reputation, the legends of divine favor and demonic assistance, these were weapons as deadly as swords. Žižka actively cultivated fear among his enemies. The rout at Takov in 1427, where an entire crusading army fled without fighting, was the ultimate psychological victory. Žižka, or rather his successor Prokop, wielding Žižka's legacy, had so thoroughly dominated this psychological battlefield that reputation alone defeated 100,000 men. Modern militaries understand psychological operations as a critical component of warfare. Žižka was practicing sophisticated psyops 600 years before the term was invented. Asymmetric warfare. Facing superior numbers and better-equipped enemies, Žižka refused to fight on their terms. He chose when and where to engage, forced enemies to attack disadvantageous positions, and turned his weaknesses into strengths. His peasant army lacked cavalry mobility, so he made them into an immovable fortress that destroyed cavalry charges. They lacked armor, so he gave them fortifications. They lacked training, so he drilled them until discipline compensated for experience. They lacked noble birth and its supposed martial superiority, so he proved that intelligence mattered more than bloodlines. This is textbook asymmetric warfare. The weaker force refusing conventional engagement and instead exploiting specific advantages to negate the enemy's strengths. Guerrilla warfare, insurgency tactics, terrorism, cyber warfare all share this basic principle that Žižka mastered in the 15th century. But Žižka's deeper legacy isn't military, it's social and spiritual. He proved that commoners could defeat their natural superiors. Medieval society was built on assumptions of inherent noble superiority, that nobles ruled because they were better bred, better trained, ordained by God to lead. The knightly class justified its privileges by claiming military indispensability. Žižka shattered that illusion permanently. He took farmers who had spent their lives behind plows and showed they could destroy knights. He took craftsmen who worked leather and metal and made them more effective than professional soldiers. He demonstrated that intelligence, organization, and motivation mattered infinitely more than birth or wealth. When Žižka's peasants stood in their wagon fortress and watched German knights flee in terror, they learned a lesson that couldn't be unlearned. The old order was vulnerable. The powerful could be defeated. The natural hierarchy wasn't natural at all. It was sustained by violence and myth, and both could be overcome. This was revolutionary, in the most literal sense. The Hussite movement wasn't just about religious reform, it was about human dignity and social equality. The radical Taborites practiced proto-communism with property held in common and minimal class distinctions. They insisted that a peasant's soul was equal to a king's before God. These ideas would echo through history. The German Peasants' War of 1524–25 drew inspiration from Hussite example. The English Civil War and the radical movements it spawned, levelers, diggers, ranters, all had intellectual roots in Bohemia. The French and American revolutions, with their proclamations of equality, were distant descendants of ideas first weaponized by Žižka's flail-wielding farmers. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Žižka's story is the blindness itself and what it symbolizes. In any rational assessment, losing both eyes should have ended his military career. Command in pre-modern warfare depended almost entirely on visual assessment, reading terrain, watching enemy movements, coordinating complex maneuvers. A blind general was a logical impossibility. Yet, Žižka's blindness became, paradoxically, a source of strength. It forced him to develop systems that didn't depend on his personal observation. He created a command structure where information flowed efficiently through clear chains of communication. His subordinates understood their roles perfectly. The army functioned as an organism rather than depending on one man's vision. This was modern military organization before modernity existed. Žižka anticipated the staff system, the importance of reconnaissance networks, the need for clear communication protocols. He had to, because he couldn't see. His blindness also had immense symbolic power. To his followers, God had taken Žižka's physical sight to enhance his spiritual vision. He saw truth more clearly than those with functioning eyes. He perceived what others missed, the hidden weakness in enemy formations, the perfect moment to counterattack, the path to victory through apparent impossibility. The psychological impact was devastating to knightly confidence. These were men who had spent lifetimes training for warfare, who believed their skill and breeding made them superior. Then they faced a blind, old peasant-born commander who consistently outwitted them. It broke their worldview. In this sense, Žižka became a living parable, that true vision comes from within, that physical limitations mean nothing compared to strength of will and clarity of purpose, that what appears as weakness can be transformed into terrifying strength.
The blind leading the sighted to victory after victory, proving that those who claim to see are often blind to what matters most. Yet we must acknowledge the darkness in this story. Žižka was not a gentle reformer or peaceful prophet. He was a warrior who understood that mercy could be fatal weakness. His campaigns were brutal. Prisoners were rarely taken. Executing captives saved resources and terrorized enemies. Towns that resisted were burned. Civilian casualties were accepted as inevitable. The Hussite Wars left Bohemia devastated, its population reduced by perhaps a quarter through warfare, disease, and famine. The civil war among Hussites, believers killing believers over doctrinal differences, revealed the tragedy inherent in revolutionary movements. Žižka himself fought and killed other Hussites when their visions of reformation diverged from his. The purity of the original cause became corrupted by power struggles, personal ambitions, and ideological rigidity. The Battle of Lipany stands as a warning. Revolutions devour their children. The radicals who had been most faithful to the original vision were annihilated by moderates willing to compromise. Was this betrayal or pragmatism? Both, perhaps. The moderates survived and achieved partial reforms. The radicals remained pure and died. Žižka died before this final tragedy, but he contributed to conditions that made it possible. His uncompromising approach, his demand for absolute discipline and loyalty, his willingness to wage war against anyone who opposed his vision. These qualities made him an effective military commander, but also created divisions that ultimately proved fatal to the movement. He built a military machine of extraordinary effectiveness, but machines can't resolve questions of political philosophy or religious doctrine. When the military threats diminished, the Hussites had no framework for maintaining unity. They only knew how to fight external enemies, not how to peacefully coexist with each other. This is a common revolutionary tragedy. The skills and mindset required to overthrow an old order are often incompatible with building a new one. Warriors make poor peacetime leaders. Uncompromising revolutionaries struggle with the compromises required for stable governance. Today, Jan Žižka remains a towering figure in Czech national identity. A massive bronze statue of him overlooks Prague, the largest equestrian statue in the world, erected in the 1950s. Czech military units bear his name. He appears in films, novels, video games, and scholarly studies. He is simultaneously national hero, military genius, and symbol of Czech resistance to foreign domination. But his legacy extends far beyond Czech nationalism. In military science, professional military academies worldwide study Žižka's campaigns. The wagon concept influenced European military development well into the gunpowder age. When armies developed artillery parks and fortified gun positions, they were building on principles Žižka pioneered with wagons. His understanding that warfare is fundamentally about logistics, positioning, and morale rather than individual heroism anticipated modern military thought. The concept that common soldiers, properly organized and motivated, could defeat elite forces challenged aristocratic military culture and opened the path toward meritocratic military systems. In religious history, the Hussites paved the way for the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther acknowledged his debt to Jan Hus. When Luther's reforms spread across Europe in the 1500s, they succeeded partly because the Hussites had already broken the myth of Catholic invincibility and demonstrated that Reformation was possible even against violent suppression. The Hussite principle of scripture in vernacular language, communion in both kinds, and challenges to clerical authority became central to Protestant theology. The Utraquist Church's survival in Bohemia provided a living example of successful religious reformation. In social history, the Hussite movement, particularly the radical Taborites, represented one of Europe's first large-scale social revolutions. Their proto-communist economics, their insistence on equality before God, their challenge to feudal hierarchy, these ideas would resurface repeatedly in European history. The German Peasants' War, the English Civil War's radical movements, Enlightenment philosophies of equality, even socialist and communist ideologies of the 19th and 20th centuries all have intellectual lineages traceable to Bohemia in the 1420s. In disability studies, Žižka's success as a blind commander challenges assumptions about disability and capability. He demonstrated that physical impairment doesn't determine effectiveness, that adaptability and intelligence can overcome limitations others consider insurmountable. His story resonates with modern disability rights movements, that accommodation and systemic support can enable people with disabilities to achieve extraordinary things, that normal is overrated, that different ways of perceiving and interacting with the world can be advantages rather than merely challenges to overcome. The enduring questions. Jan Žižka's life raises questions that remain relevant across 6 centuries. Can violence serve justice? Žižka believed he fought for God and the oppressed. His enemies believed the same about themselves. Both sides committed atrocities in the name of righteousness. The Hussite wars demonstrated that conviction alone doesn't determine right from wrong, that the means of struggle shape the outcome as much as the goals motivating it. When is compromise betrayal and when is wisdom? The radical Taborites refused compromise and were destroyed. The moderate Utraquists compromised and survived, achieving some reforms but abandoning the revolution's full promise. Which choice was correct? Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps the question itself is wrong. Maybe historical circumstances determine outcomes more than moral choices. What makes a leader great? Žižka never lost a battle, but the cause he fought for ultimately failed to achieve its most radical goals. Is a general who wins every fight, but whose movement collapses after his death, truly successful? Or is the measure of leadership found in the transformation he inspired, the possibilities he revealed, the courage he gave to those who followed him, even unto death? How do we judge figures who were both heroic and terrible? Žižka inspired desperate people, gave them hope and victory, proved that the powerful could be challenged. He also waged merciless war, killed thousands, including fellow Hussites, and contributed to his country's devastation. He was brilliant and brutal, visionary and ruthless. Like most consequential historical figures, he doesn't fit comfortably into categories of hero or villain.
The 25 years between Joan's death and her posthumous retrial were years in which France completed the transformation she had begun. The English grip on French territory weakened progressively, their armies unable to recapture the momentum they had lost at Orléans. The psychological impact of Joan's victories proved more enduring. Wept for the English dead, how she had predicted victories before battles were fought. These stories took on the quality of legend even while the men who told them were still alive. Joan became larger than life even as her actual life was being deliberately erased by those who had condemned her. The church that had burned her as a heretic now found itself in an awkward position. Common people venerated Joan as a saint, praying to her, attributing miracles to her intercession. Priests found themselves unable to suppress this popular devotion without alienating their congregations. Meanwhile, Charles VII, now secure on his throne, recognized that Joan's condemnation cast a shadow over the legitimacy of his own coronation. Politics and piety converged in the decision to re-examine Joan's trial. Pope Calixtus III authorized the inquiry in 1455, and the proceedings began the following year. It was called a nullification trial. Its purpose was to determine whether the original trial had been conducted fairly or if it had been a corrupt proceeding designed to reach a predetermined verdict. The answer, of course, was obvious to anyone who examined the evidence honestly. But the nullification trial served a purpose beyond simple justice. It allowed the Church to correct what was becoming an increasingly embarrassing error, and it allowed Charles to solidify his legitimacy by association with a martyr rather than a heretic. The testimony collected during the nullification trial provides the most intimate portrait of Joan that survives. Her childhood friends described a pious girl who loved attending church and was kind to the poor. Her military companions described a commander who combined tactical brilliance with genuine compassion. Her enemies, forced to testify under oath, reluctantly admitted that they could find no fault in her behavior or her faith. Isabelle Romee, Joan's mother, traveled to Paris to petition for her daughter's retrial. She was an elderly woman by then, worn down by grief and poverty, but she stood before the ecclesiastical court and demanded justice for her child. Her testimony was simple and devastating. Joan had been a good daughter, a faithful Christian, and a loyal servant of France. She had harmed no one except in righteous war. She had died proclaiming her faith in Christ. How could such a person be a heretic? The court heard testimony about Joan's childhood, her voices, her military career, and her trial. They examined the records of the original proceedings and found them riddled with irregularities. Questions had been asked in bad faith, designed to trap rather than illuminate.
Joan had been denied legal counsel. The judges had been biased, many of them in the pay of the English. The verdict had been decided before the trial began. On July 7, 1456, the nullification trial concluded with a declaration that the original verdict was null and void. Joan of Arc was innocent. The judgment that had condemned her was declared to be tainted by fraud, calumny, wickedness, contradictions, and manifest errors of fact and law. Her reputation was restored. Her memory was rehabilitated. But the declaration couldn't return her to life, couldn't give her back the years she should have had, couldn't undo the agony of her death. Justice came 25 years too late. For the soldiers who had fought with Joan and survived to see her rehabilitation, the nullification trial must have been bittersweet. They had known from the beginning that she was innocent. They had witnessed her courage, her faith, her kindness. They had watched her lead armies to victory against impossible odds. They didn't need a court to tell them she had been wronged. Jean d'Alençon, the duke who had fought alongside Joan and called her a friend, testified at the nullification trial. He was an old man by then, his warrior days behind him, but he spoke of Joan with the reverence of someone describing a saint. He recounted battles they had fought together, strategies she had proposed, moments when her presence had turned potential defeat into victory. She bore herself bravely in all things, he testified. She was simple and young, but her words and deeds were those of someone far wiser and more experienced. Lahir, the rough mercenary commander who had been skeptical of Joan at first, had died years before the retrial, but his words about her survived in other accounts. He had been transformed by knowing her. This brutal soldier who cursed constantly and killed without remorse had learned to pray before battles because Joan insisted on it. After her death, he continued the practice. She had changed him, and he never forgot it. These testimonies revealed something important about Joan's impact. She didn't just win battles, she transformed the people around her. She made cynical soldiers believe in righteousness. She made defeated armies believe in victory. She made a weak king believe he could rule. Her faith was so absolute that it became contagious, spreading to everyone who came near her.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.